Now, we just did a study. How would you evaluate whether that Freudian psychoanalysis, what's a Freudian psychoanalysis again? That's a treatment where the patient comes in, we have free association, we have maybe dream analysis, the person might talk about their dreams. After a while, the person is paying, big money to this psychoanalyst to analyze the dreams. And the person says, I dreamt I was smoking a cigar. The person says, a cigar? That's a phallic symbol. That's a penis. And you put it in your mouth. Somebody pointed this out to Freud. He said, sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. Stuck it back in his mouth. It's a big cigar. He ended up getting cancer of the jaw. That's what actually killed him. He had to get the hell out of Austria. When the Germans overran Austria, he was a Jew, and the Germans overran Austria, he was in a lot of trouble. He went to England, and that's where he died of jaw cancer. They acquired a cancer. Got killed there. Sometimes a cigar is only a cigar, but when isn't it? Well, sometimes it's a penis, or maybe it's a breast. Maybe it has to do with an oral fixation. So you look for symbols in the dreams. And then the patient, at some point after about 3 or 4 years, says, I've invested $250,000 in therapy and I don't think it's doing me any good. I'd like to quit. And the therapist says, that's called resistance. And it's a sign that your subconscious is aware we're about to make a breakthrough. You're not aware of this, but your subconscious is so afraid we're going to reveal what's really going on in your subconscious that it's telling you to say, let's quit therapy. This is a sign we're on the brink of a breakthrough. You've got to continue right now. So I'm sure you'll sign up for another series of 3 times a week at $300 a 50-minute session. So resistance, and we have transference. Is this stuff any good? Well, the theory is discredited, but is the therapy good? Is talk therapy? Also known as insight. This type of talk therapy is insight-oriented therapy. You're trying to get insight into what's the real psychodynamics or psychodynamic therapy. Is this stuff beneficial? And how would you analyze that question? Well, how about do an experiment? Unfortunately, very few experiments have been done, but I'll tell you the one that I am aware of that's the best done experiment that I'm aware of on the effects of talk therapy. There's kind of talk therapies that include Freud's psychoanalysis, and also another type of therapy I'll be telling you about in a little bit, Rogerian, basically, type of therapy, a client-centered therapy. And so here's the experiment that was done. Here's our question. Is psychotherapy beneficial? You can erase this right here. So here's the summary of what's happening today, the review, and part 5, hold on to it, part 7, homework 7. Here's what they did. There was a group of 600 boys who were picked as headed for trouble. They were potential juvenile delinquents, ages 5 to 13. And these were kids that were headed for trouble. The kids were randomly assigned to conditions. Remember, why do we want random assignment? So that the only thing to get rid of confounded variables. Random assignment makes the independent variable independent of other variables. Otherwise we have confounded variables. We don't want to take all the kids that are nice and put them in one group and all the ones that seem kind of nasty and put them in the other group, because it might be the nastiness is related to whatever it is we're trying to do. And the independent variable was 5 years of face-to-face individual psychotherapy. So they met with trained professionals who worked with them versus being in a control group who were measured and kept track of, who did not receive the psychotherapy. That was the independent variable of this study. And there were many dependent variables. Something like 47 dependent variables. Now during these 5 years, so here's the 5-year period, and then they had a 3-year follow-up. During which they measured a number of dependent variables, including court appearances in the juvenile court. Now, is it good to be told, given a summons saying you have to appear in court to answer the charges? That's considered a bad thing, right? We're making a value judgment. Is it beneficial if the people that receive the treatment end up having to go to court? Be beneficial if they don't have to go to court, right? So it's a bad thing. We're making a value judgment about benefits of therapy. And so these were kids who were headed for trouble. The idea was that the therapy might prevent them from getting into trouble with the law. Now during the 5 years, the therapists were writing magazine articles with the following kind of stories. It's a crime to have a control group. Everybody should be receiving the treatment. I don't know why we don't give this treatment to everybody, because it's obviously helping. We can tell about 2/3 of the boys, I asked the therapists, which boys do you think are being helped by your treatment? They said about 2/3 of the boys that we're working with, they thought were being helped by it. When you ask the boys, 2/3 of the boys in the treatment group, well, 62% thought that they'd been helped. Some of them gave testimonials. If it wasn't for my counselor, I'd be in jail today. Stuff like that. So they were given testimonials. Testimonial, though, is not a difference between a treatment group and a control group. So here's what this one's the follow-up. Here's what was found. In the treatment group, now there were 600, there were 300 in each group. They used a coin toss to decide which group they went to, with one exception. If there were 2 brothers that were identified, they would toss a coin once, and both of them would either go into control group or into the treatment group. So you wouldn't have one boy in a family in one group and one in the other. So one would be getting the therapy and the other not. So they would toss a coin once for both boys. Other than that, it was strictly a coin toss with that little restriction. So by age 17, only 1/3 had become delinquent and only 14% ended up in jail, and the therapists immediately declared success. But here's what they found. Court appearances. 96 boys out of the 300, so that's a little less than 1/3, in the treatment group had to appear in court. And now the key number comes here, doesn't it? You need to have a control group. Is this good? 96 out of 300, that means 2/3 were not charged with anything, more than 200 didn't. So this number is important. The question is it going to be bigger or smaller? Comes out 92. So which group was better off? Control group. Well, how many crimes had they been charged with? $264 versus 218. So which group is doing better? Control group is doing better. How many kids had one appearance before the court? 49 in each group. Had to appear just one time. 2 or more. Yeah, I don't mean an app for your cell phone, I mean appearances here. 65 and 52. So, Tuber and Powers concluded, who did this study based on the 3-year follow-up, an 8-year project, 5 years of therapy. They got the boys at a young age. They had a socially important goal to try to prevent crime. They had 5 years of face-to-face psychotherapy. This is quite expensive to do. They had a proper control group. They had random assignment to conditions. These are all good features of an experiment. Well-designed experiment with a 3-year follow-up and interesting dependent variables. They concluded this: we submit that the data yield one definite conclusion, that the burden of proof is on anybody who claims specific results for a given form of therapy. Well, 30 years later, Joan McCord followed up these 2 groups to see what would happen after 30 years. So we now have a gap of 30 years. This is called the Tuber and Powers study, also known as the Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study. So she was able to track these people down, and she was able to track down most of them, but not everybody. After 30 years, she studied hospital records, death records, death certificates, tried to track people down by all sorts of different methods. And she looked at how many had juvenile records and serious adult crimes. So this is all juvenile stuff. This is now, so these kids started 5 to 13, so you add 8 years to that. So basically you're getting to the end of their juvenile years. And then 30 years later, she now looks at adult crimes, not just the crimes done as children. So juvenile record and serious adult, 25 boys in each group. So no difference on that. But how about no juvenile record and serious adult crime? She found 24. There were 24 boys that had they were not included in these 96. They were included in the 204 others that had no juvenile record, but 24 had adult crimes that they were convicted of versus 17 in the control group. So which group is doing better on this? The control group. Among those who committed crimes as adults, how many did more than 2 adult crimes? Uh, 78% and 67%. So also favoring the control group. Evidence of alcoholism. Alcoholism, the operational definition of alcoholism is answering yes to 3 out of 5 key questions. And the questions are things like, do you drink every day? Do you drink in the morning? Do you drink when you're alone? Have you gotten into an accident or had a problem because of drinking? Been fired because of drinking? And answering yes to 3 out of 5 of these questions They say you've got alcoholism as a problem. 17% in the treatment group and 7% in the control group. So which group is doing better on that? Had died. $24 in each group. Age at death. For those who died. So for the 24 in the two groups, is it better to live longer or shorter? We're going to make a value judgment. It's better to live longer. They died on average at 32, these 24 who had died by the 30-year follow-up. So these died on average at age 38. So 6 years more life for the on average for the 24 in the control group. Had jobs as white-collar workers. Is it better to be a white-collar worker or a blue-collar worker?
White.
Depends on the U.S.
In the U.S., they're all in the U.S. here. So in the U.S., it's typically higher status and better pay. A white-collar job, blue-collar job means you're working in a factory or doing pick and shovel labor or things like that, farming, mining. 29% in the treatment group and 43% in the control group. So control group did better in terms of their occupation, the types of occupations they got. Among the blue-collar workers were satisfied with their work. So they asked them, are you satisfied with your work? So blue-collar satisfaction. Are you satisfied with work? We're going to say it's better to be satisfied with your work than not satisfied with your work. In this group, 80% were satisfied with their work. And in this group, 95% were satisfied with their work. So which group is doing better in terms of job satisfaction? And here's a health grab bag of things that were thought to have maybe some kind of a health grab bag of conditions that at one time or another were thought to be maybe psychologically related in some way. Nowadays, people probably wouldn't argue that they're necessarily psychologically related, but here's the grab bag of things they thought were psychologically related. Arthritis, gout, emphysema, depression, ulcers, asthma, allergies, high blood pressure, and heart trouble. They used to think, a person who's nervous is more at risk for heart trouble. Heart disease maybe is related to stress, feeling stressed out or something. And they found that there was a difference in the rates of health. 21% had one or more of these conditions in the treatment group and 11% in the control group. So twice as many had this collection of health problems: arthritis, gout, emphysema, depression, ulcers, asthma, allergies, high blood pressure, heart trouble. Main difference was in high blood pressure and heart problems, heart disease. Evidence of serious mental illness, serious enough to require hospitalization in a mental hospital. So serious mental illness. 21 former boys in each group had been hospitalized for mental illness. 71% of these were diagnosed as manic depressive or schizophrenic, and 67% of these were judged as having a personality disorder. So even though an equal number had been hospitalized for mental illness, the seriousness of these mental illnesses were rated higher. So what's the probability? These differences aren't huge, but here's quite a number, a difference in number. You know, we're talking about 4 boys in this condition and 7 people who committed crimes, about 2 or more crimes. But so there are fewer crimes being committed by the control group. If you were the victim of one of these crimes, you would certainly prefer not to have been the victim of this crime, or if your mother, your sister, your child was a victim of rape or something. That's pretty serious. But these aren't huge differences in terms of these numbers, but they all favor the control group. There were other variables that showed no difference or small enough difference they weren't significant. The probability, McCord concludes, so the probability of getting these 7 significant differences, 7 harmful effects, given the null hypothesis that there was no effect of the treatment, is less than 1 in 10,000, according to Joan McCord. So she rejects the hypothesis that the treatment had no effect in favor of the hypothesis that the treatment was harmful. I'll read to you from some of her conclusions here. The objective evidence presents a disturbing picture. The program seems not only to have failed to prevent its clients from committing crimes, thus corroborating other projects, and she cites a number of other papers that came to the same conclusions, but also to have produced negative side effects as compared with the control group. Men who had been in the treatment program were more likely to commit at least a second crime. Men who had been in the treatment program were more likely to evidence signs of alcoholism. So more than 2 to 1, the likelihood of alcoholism. Men from the treatment group more commonly manifested signs of serious mental illness. Well, the number was the same, but the seriousness of the diagnosis was worse. Among men who had died, those from the treatment group died younger. So of the 24 that died, these people lived at an average of 6 years longer. Men from the treatment group were more likely to report having at least one stress-related disease. In particular, they were more likely to have experienced high blood pressure or heart trouble. So this health grab bag is about 2 to 1 in terms of the incidence of these health problems. Men in the treatment group tended to have occupations with lower prestige. So the white-collar workers, 43% versus 29%. And men from the treatment group tended to more often to report their work as not satisfying. So she says, it should be noted that the side effects that seemed to have resulted from treatment were subtle. I'll skip ahead here. She computes this as probability that she thinks is less than 1 in 10,000. That she did 57 tests and found 7 of them significant, all favoring the control group. At this juncture, it seems appropriate to suggest several possible interpretations of the subtle effects of treatment. Interaction with adults whose values are different from those of the family milieu may produce later internal conflicts that manifest themselves in disease and or dissatisfaction. Agency intervention may create dependency upon outside assistance. When this assistance is no longer available, the individual may experience symptoms of dependency and resentment. The treatment program may have generated such high expectations that subsequent experiences tended to produce symptoms of deprivation. Or finally, through receiving the services of a, quote, welfare project, Those in the treatment program may have justified the help they received by perceiving themselves as requiring help. There were many variations to treatment. Some of these may have been beneficial. Overall, however, the message seems clear. Intervention programs risk damaging the individuals they are designed to assist. These findings may be taken by some as grounds for cessation of social action programs. I believe that would be a mistake. In my opinion, new programs ought to be developed. We should, however, address the problems of potential damage through the use of pilot projects with mandatory evaluations. I agree with her conclusions there. A little more can be said about the different types of treatments. So when these results began to come out, going back to the original Tuber and Powers study that showed that the results were negative, the therapists who had been writing all these articles saying there didn't need to be a control group at all. Are you going to ask a question or just stretching? Stretching. The brownie said, just stretch. So the people had been writing the magazine articles saying it's immoral to have a control group, everybody should get the treatment, now immediately began pointing at each other. And they said, the kind of treatment that I give is beneficial, but those other people, those other therapists, they don't know what they're doing, they're causing harm. Now there were 3 groups of therapists you could identify. And so they subdivided the data. There were about 100 boys each who received each of 3 general types of therapy. What were the types of therapies that were being used in those days? Well, there was directive therapies, mostly Freudian. What do we mean by a directive therapy? A directive therapy is where the therapist listens to the client or patient and says, I will tell you what your problem is. You're obsessed with sex. You are thinking you want to have sex with your mother and kill your father. This creates problems for you. No wonder you no longer work for your father. You know, stuff like that, right? Directive. I am going to tell you what your problem is and what you should do about it. Then there was a group that were reacting against this, that said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to be non-directive. And a major player or person is Rogers. Nowadays, the term humanistic might be applied. This one might be called insight-oriented. Or maybe psychodynamic, because it has to deal with how the subconscious and the superego and the id are fighting with each other in the subconscious world, and we need to understand what's happening in the subconscious world before we can understand what a person's problems are. The humanistic, for one, says the person knows their own problems better than anybody, so we should ask the person what their problem is. Have you played with Eliza? How many of you did the Eliza assignment? Yes. What did you find? Did Eliza ever tell you what your problem was? Eliza asked you a lot of questions, like, how do you feel about that? What do you think you should do about it? Do you feel it'd be better for you to, you know, when you said hello, do you think it'd be better for you to say hello than not say hello? Right? That's just a computer program. It actually fooled some people in the old days. They thought they actually were communicating with the person, you know, by an early form of texting. So this computer program was written years ago. But the Rogerian therapist says, you know, I won't tell you what your problem is. The Rogerian therapist says, and so how are we feeling today? And are you feeling well adjusted? And what are your problems? Well, what is your problem? Well, how do you feel about that? Do you think you should do something? What do you think you should do? Do you think that would help? Are you planning to do it then? So they would basically just ask the client. So Rogers is also called client-centered therapy. And the Rogerians said, obviously this directive therapy, telling the patient what their problem is screwed up, because how do you know what in the hell is going on in somebody else's subconscious mind? You should ask the person to decide what their problem is. So you got arrested last week, and do you think that's a problem for you? Do you think that's a good thing for you for the future of your life? What do you think you should do about it? You haven't been going to school? Do you think you should be going to school? So you ask the person. And then others describe themselves as eclectic. And these people said, well, we've read the various approaches and the different types of therapies, and we studied, you know, I take ideas, and I sometimes use different techniques with different clients, depending on what their situation and their problem is. So there were these three groups, and about 100 of each had each of these therapies. When they divided the data up, there wasn't any difference among the groups. So despite the magazine articles that first claimed that it was wonderful, they could see the good they were doing, then the magazine articles that attacked the Rogerians and the Freudians attacked each other and attacked the eclectics as not having any clear idea what they wanted to do. So these different groups were attacking each other. Then they analyzed the data and didn't find anything. The current reaction to this is that it's often not taught to people in clinical. Have you had it presented to you in a course in clinical? Somebody presented the Cambridge-Somerville study.
No.
This is the best done empirical study on the effects of psychotherapy of which I'm aware. If there's some better ones, you or any of the students can find them, come tell me about them, because I want to know about them. There are a lot of little studies. And some of these little studies they try to put together in what's known as meta-analysis. I'll say more about it later, but meta-analysis is an attempt to take a lot of little studies and put them together and try to reach a bigger conclusion by taking a study of 30 people tested here or 15 tested there and try to combine them. So we've got a study of rat phobia done for a doctoral dissertation, and a study of anorgasmia in women done for somebody else's doctoral dissertation with 20 women, or a study of, you know, agoraphobia with 18 agoraphobics. You know, so you have a number of different studies, and you try to put them together into, it's like apples and oranges, you try to come to a bigger conclusion. I'll say more about the meta-analysis and some other things later, but basically, how many of you had heard about the Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study? Probably none of you. And I think it's a disservice. Sometimes some other psychologists say, you shouldn't tell that story because that makes us look bad. That makes it look like people that are charging money for therapies that are harmful should be disciplined, not rewarded. I would like to charge money for this, and you're giving me a bad name. But if people don't know this, you know what they do? They do what they've been doing. They tell the Congress, no more taxes, we don't want any more studies of what works with psychological problems. We don't want to fund any research, we know what to do. We need to train more Freudian psychoanalysts to go out there and treat people, to reduce the cost of this therapy from $300 for a 50-minute session to $150 for a 50-minute session. 10 years of treatment 3 times a week. And so we don't want to do research to find the answer to the problem. We don't want to spend money figuring out what cures Ebola or what prevents it. We don't want to spend money trying to treat cancer because we think we already have effective treatments. So cut taxes. Main thing is cut taxes for the rich people that are financing political elections. But we don't want to do research to find the answers to these problems. So the public, unaware that we don't have answers to very important problems, like the problem of mental illness, I'm going to be explaining to you, these are huge problems costing a fortune to society, causing pain and suffering, causing money, causing grief, causing injury to people. The fact that there are people with mental issues. I mean, you're reading about it in the paper and seeing it on the news every day. Some horrible thing has happened because some guy parked in his parking space. College students parked in his parking place, so they went out and shot a bunch of people. It just happened in the news. People with mental problems are causing other people not only themselves, but other people, a lot of grief and suffering. We need to do something about it, but people think we don't need to study the problem because we already know the answers. Well, the problem is we don't really know all the answers, but the public is not aware of it. So they're not aware that we don't really understand how to treat many of these conditions. All right, well, we'll continue next time.